During the 1960s, two of the most influential leaders were Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X.
Malcolm X was an African-American Muslim minister who was known for taking an aggressive yet more defensive approach to civil rights. Malcolm X strongly believed in African Americans defending and protecting themselves from racist attackers during a time of Jim Crow laws. Malcolm X heavily influenced the philosophies and actions of the Black Panther Party, even though he was assassinated in 1965, a year before the formation of the Black Panther Party.
Martin Luther King Jr., born January 15, 1929, was an American activist who became the most visible spokesperson and leader in the civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. Born in Atlanta, King is best known for advancing civil rights through nonviolence and civil disobedience, tactics his Christian beliefs and the non-violent activism of Mahatma Gandhi helped inspire. His peaceful protests were more effective than Malcolm X's use of violence. This allowed for the advancement of African American civil rights.
The Freedom Riders were a group of civil rights activists who rode the interstate buses through the deeply segregated South in 1961. These activists rode the bus in order to challenge the previous Supreme Court decision, Boyton v. Virginia, in 1960, which ruled that segregated public buses were unconstitutional.
On July 20, 1969, American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin became the first humans ever to land on the moon. Approximately 6.5 hours later, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. The Apollo 11 mission occurred 8 years after President John F. Kennedy announced a national goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. This also represented an advancement in American science and technology.
John F. Kennedy was president from 1960 to 1963. He is known mainly for his assassination in 1963, but also for the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. His first year as president has been described as a disaster by himself and others, but he also made notable accomplishments during his rule. He was not the greatest president, but is seen as one of the better presidents of American history.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders of the U.S. and Soviet Union engaged in a tense, 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba, just 90 miles from U.S. shores. In a TV address on October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy notified Americans about the presence of the missiles, explained his decision to enact a naval blockade around Cuba, and made it clear the U.S. was prepared to use military force if necessary to neutralize this perceived threat to national security. The Vietnam War began on November 1, 1955 and ended on April 30, 1975. The Vietnam War pitted the Communist government of North Vietnam against the South Vietnam and the United States. The conflict was intensified by the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Communist forces ended the war by seizing control of South Vietnam in 1975, and the country was unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Protests against the Vietnam War took place in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The protests were part of the movement in opposition to the Vietnam and took place mainly in the United States. The growing anti-war movement alarmed in the United States government.
Yeah, Earth.
Fight the war, we don't want it anymore, we want peace.
Peace, peace, peace! Fight the war! Bring us home! Please, please, please!
Roe v. Wade was a huge landmark in women's rights. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides a fundamental right to privacy, which protects women's rights to have an abortion if they want to. This decision was so big because women were in charge of their bodies.
On 22nd, I stated in very specific terms, and I state again to every one of you listening tonight, these facts. I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in.
On June 17, 1972, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which led to an investigation that revealed multiple abuses of power by the Nixon administration. Although Nixon took aggressive steps to cover up the crime, it was revealed he played a role in the conspiracy. He was sentenced to be impeached but resigned beforehand. The Watergate scandal changed American politics forever, leading to many Americans to question their leaders and think more critically about them.
The Iran hostage crisis was a diplomatic standoff between the United States and Iran. 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage for 444 days from November 4, 1979 to January 20, 1981. This was the first time the United States was forced to deal with Islamic extremists. Sandra Day O'Connor was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States from 1981 to 2006 and was the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. A moderate conservative, she was known for her dispassionate and meticulously researched opinions.
Cold War tension began to ease across Eastern Europe. The spokesman for East Berlin's Communist Party announced a change in the city's relations with the West. On November 9, 1989, he announced that citizens of the GDR were free to cross the country's borders, and with that, the fall of the Berlin Wall.
The Iran-Contra affair was a secret U.S. arms deal that traded missiles and other arms to free some Americans held hostage by terrorists in Lebanon, but also used funds from the arms deal to support armed conflict in Nicaragua. These actions were prohibited by the U.S. Congress and violated public policy of government.